So I'm going to talk about the status of the mobile web, as you can see here. And first, let me introduce myself. I'm a mobile web developer, so I have been doing web development since 1995, so long time ago. And I have started doing mobile development in 2001, so also long time ago for the mobile space. I'm from Argentina, or I'm based in Argentina, but basically I'm traveling a lot. I have just reached the milestone of 50 different countries visited. So I'm traveling a lot doing conferences and talks. I have written some books, programming the mobile web from Variety Media, and I'm finishing my new book on high performance mobile web. I have been also doing online trainings for O'Reilly, and I will be doing some workshops at the next ForwardJS next February. So I hope I can see some of you there. Questions, yes, please. So as we mentioned before, there is a questions the Q&A tab inside the UI here in this webinar. So if you add your questions there, I will have some time at the end so I can answer your questions there. And of course, you can follow me later by Twitter or any other social network. So let's start. And before really talking about stuff that we're going to cover during probably the next hour, the first thing I want to mention is, why are we talking about the mobile web? And probably that's something that most of you are also thinking about. So do we have a mobile web? Isn't it just the same web? So we have been talking about this for a while right now, so probably for about 5 years. So we all know that the mobile web doesn't exist from a user's point of view, right? It's the same web. The user just wants to access the same website, the same web content that she or he is accessing from a desktop. But from a developer's point of view, from a designer's point of view, from a performance point of view, we do have a mobile web, right? So that means that we are going to talk about the web on mobile devices, and we need to do something special for mobile devices. Okay, so I'm going to talk about responsive later too. So what responsive web design has to do with the mobile web, but we don't have a mobile web, so I don't think that the mobile web exists. Probably unfortunately for us, because that means that we have some job to do. The mobile web does exist, and let's talk about the mobile web today first. So we're going to talk about the status of the mobile web, so what the mobile web means for us today. So one of the things that we're going to cover, the web platforms, we're going to talk about Android, and also the web view. So when talking about web platforms, usually ask you, okay, platforms in terms of the mobile space do you usually cover? And probably you will answer iOS and Android. So that answer is probably. The problem is that here we are talking about operating systems, and we are not talking about web platforms, okay? And that's the usual problem here. Unfortunately, there are no unique resource where we can find all the information about the stats. So here you have 6 different sources where you can find information about market share in terms of mobile browsing. So I did the job for you. So I analyzed all these data sources, and I came to like an answer in terms of how the mobile web looks like from a platform's point of view, from a browser's point of view. So, but before that, let's think about this for a minute. I'm sure that most of you are social network users. You have seen this webinar from a Twitter link, and I mean, the Twitter application, probably the browser didn't appear there, but a Twitter in-app browsing experience. Sometimes it's not just about browsers, and most of the time it's also about apps, an in-app browsing experience. So for example, on Facebook, if you click on a link, then that link will lead you to an in-app browsing experience inside Facebook, for example, or inside Twitter. And in that case, we are talking about the web view. And based on recent reports, a quarter of the web browsing from a mobile device right now is coming from a web view. So it's a lot, right? 25% of the users are browsing the web through a web view. So that means that we need to understand that when we are designing and developing our web apps, because most of the time we are not thinking on the web view in terms of performance, in terms of the UI, in terms of what features do we have inside the web view, for example. And from this same report, we know that Facebook is taking 40% of the web view browsing. Then we have Chrome, Twitter, and other apps like they have like a similar solution. So now we know that it's not just about browsers, it's also about the web view. So let's talk about some real data on web engines and web platforms that we need to support. So today, roughly, we're talking about 45% of the users are browsing the web through Android and 45% from iOS. And we have 10% of the people browsing with other browsers on other OSs. The problem is that we need to talk about browsers and not operating systems. So to talk about that, let's first start talking about iOS. So iOS, it's roughly Safari. So I'm not sure if you know this, but for example, Chrome on iOS, and now we have Firefox on iOS. They're not really Chrome and Firefox. So Chrome on iOS, it's not really Chrome. It sounds weird, but Chrome on iOS, it's using basically a different engine because it's using the Safari engine, roughly. It's the web view, okay? So roughly, we are talking about 25% of iOS using the web view and 75% using Safari. So that's a good one, right? It's not so bad. It's roughly Safari. And in terms of versions, we have around 60% of the users on version 9. So we know that on iOS we have a really good numbers in terms of using the latest version of the OS. In terms of Android, so here comes the tricky part. So on Android, we don't have one browser. And I think that most of you are thinking right now on Google Chrome. So probably you're thinking, hey, Android means Chrome. Well, not really. So if we look at stats, we have 2/3 of Android users browsing the web on Google Chrome. So good news. But we have 1/3 browsing the web on the browser. So the browser, usually known as Android browser, sometimes known as Android WebKit, was the browser available on Android up to Android KitKat 4.4 that is WebKit based. It's terrible in terms of performance, for example, and it's still there. And fortunately for us, so this is basically some stats from Akamai in terms of browsing on mobile. So you will see here that we have both Android browser and Chrome. Unfortunately for us, so Chrome is getting bigger at around 1% per month, and basically taking that market share from Android browser. So Android browser probably will have like a very small percentage of the users in a while, but it's still there. So today, 1/4 of the Android users are using Android browser. So we need to understand that that browser is there. And even if you look at the same phone, different browsers have different compatibility. Here you can see compatibility on HTML5test.com. So on the same browser, you have different scores. And if you're a Samsung user, for example, if you have a Samsung Galaxy, any Galaxy phone, probably you will recognize that internet icon. So that is basically the Android browser, but because the Android browser was really terrible in terms of performance, Samsung has decided to change it. So, and it's Chromium based, okay? So it's like Chrome, but it's not Chrome. So it has its own unique bugs, its own unique API compatibility. So on some devices, you will have both Chrome and internet, and that means that 1/4 of Samsung's users are using that particular internet browser. So if you're a web developer, web designer, have you ever tested your website inside that internet browser from Samsung? Here you can see that the Samsung browser is really called internet. So that's the name, right? It's a weird name. And it's not just Samsung. For example, here you have an LG G3, the same happens on the G4 and the G5, the next G5. So you have two browsers, Chrome and the Android browser. And even here in this particular phone, the Android browser seems better than Chrome. So this is just to give you an idea that it's not so simple, right? The Android world is complicated. We have half of the user using Chrome, then we have people browsing on different versions, for example, on Samsung, the Samsung browser, and 30% of the users still on the old browser engine. And then we have that 10% of others, and here we have a mix between Firefox, Internet Explorer, our friend, Opera Mini, and even UC Browser. I'm not sure if you have heard about UC Browser before. It's a browser mainly used in Asia, mainly in China and other countries in that region. So the browsing market share is not so simple. It's pretty complicated, right? So unfortunately for us, in terms of engines, that is probably what you're thinking about. Okay, but most of the browsers are the same. Well, we have a mix between Chromium, that is Chrome, WebKit, a modern WebKit, that's the WebKit that we have in Safari, and let's say an old WebKit that is there still on, for example, Android browser. So for the mobile web today, we need to understand the real ecosystem, right? Because if you're just testing your website in your iPhone 6s, that's not how the market looks like out there. So you need to understand the real ecosystem. You need to understand all the Android browsers that you have out there and how to test on them. The web view, we need to remember that we do have a lot of people browsing the web today inside Facebook, inside Twitter. And that means that we have the web view that might have different compatibility and performance. And don't think you're an average user. So that's a very important thing, right? So we are not average users. The next problem that we have on the mobile web, and probably one of the main reasons of why the mobile web exists still today, right? Performance. So performance is one of the most important parts of the mobile web. Right now, I'm going to talk a little bit about perception, differences with the desktop or the classic web engine. We are going to mention something about cellular networks and responsive web design. So most of you right now are probably thinking about responsive web design. So let's first talk about perception. There are a couple of numbers here that you have heard before. For example, that for a user to recognize an immediate feedback, right? That feedback should appear within 100 milliseconds, right? So if you tap with your finger on the screen, something should happen within 100 milliseconds. And the other important metric that we have here in performance is 1 second. So after 1 second, right, your brain starts to think on something else. For example, I have just stopped talking for a second, and probably you are thinking on something else. I don't know. It can be lunch, it can be breakfast, it can be dinner, I don't know where you are, but your brain starts to think on something else. So we must keep the user engaged in 1 second. So that means, for example, that our page load on a mobile phone should be within 1 second, because after 1 second, we are starting to lose users. And that means money for most companies and most websites. It can be direct money because you are selling objects on your website. It can be indirect money, right? Because you have less page views and you have less money coming from advertising. Other stats that are out there. For example, for every half a second delay on your mobile website, you increase users' frustration in more than 25%. So that's a lot. We don't want our users to be frustrated because of our website. So it's something that we need to understand. Also from Google, 40% of users will abandon an article if it doesn't load after 6 seconds. Okay, so it's 40% of the users. The last stat that I have for you here is that, I'm not sure if you have heard that on iOS 9, now we have ad blockers on iOS. So, and ad blockers are really important on iOS because now we realized the performance problems that we do have on most websites. Because with the iOS blocker installed, we can get up to 4 times faster websites. So it's crazy, right, that we are not thinking on performance as one of our goals, because performance means money. Not sure if you have heard about this, but Google developers, the Chrome team basically, have come with an idea of talking about Rail, right? So if this is the first time you're hearing about Rail, so let me explain what it is. So when we talk about performance, sometimes it's difficult to understand what we are measuring and why, right? But probably the why is because we don't want the user to be frustrated, and we don't want the user to get out of my website. I want the user to spend more money or more time inside my website. But the what, so what to measure. So Rail, it's a mix of different things, so to remember. So R is for response. So that means that we must send a response to a user within 100 milliseconds. Then we have the A is for animation. The idea is that animation should be in 16 milliseconds. That's to keep a 60 frame per second rate. Then we have the I, and that's idle. The idea here is that if you're doing something, like, for example, updating some calculations or something like that, it shouldn't take more than 50 milliseconds to keep a very performant mobile website. And finally, we have load, and that means we must load our page within 1 second. I know that sounds weird because 1 second is really a short period of time, but we can do that, right? And there are techniques, tricks, and best practices that we can apply to achieve these perception milestones, right? These goals. But why do we need a special care on mobile? So why don't we talk about performance as a whole? Because, yeah, performance is important on every device, okay? On desktop, on a tablet, on a mobile phone. But why do we need a special care on mobile? Well, mostly because of cellular connections. So sometimes we are on Wi-Fi, that's fine, but most of the time we are on cellular connections. And I know what some of you might be thinking right now. Okay, hey, we have 4G, right? We don't need to worry about performance anymore. Well, I'm sorry to be the guy giving you bad news. Let's see why. Today, only 10% of the people globally is in 4G. Only 10%, right? Only 10%. And in US, it's around 55%, right? Of course, it depends on the region. But even when you are on 4G, 30% of the time, 4G was not used. Okay, so, and you were in 3G or 2G. Okay. But most of the time, when we're talking about 4G, 3G, or Wi-Fi, we think about bandwidth. Okay. So we're talking about bandwidth. And yes, of course, 4G has more bandwidth than 3G or 2G. But when we are talking about web browsing, so the bandwidth is not really the important part, right? It's not really important because we are just downloading very small files. So we know HTML, CSS, JavaScript, a couple of images, and other resources. So these files are usually small. When you're watching Netflix or YouTube, yeah, probably the one bandwidth is important, but not for web browsing. For web browsing, we need to care about latency, right? And if you look at the diagram, if you're getting the update in the webinar UI, so you will see that the latency is there on cellular connection. So yeah, on 2G, the latency can be up to 1 second. So that means that every HTTP request can take up to 1 second just for nothing, just for sending the request. On 3G, it's much better. And on 4G, it's also better. But it can be up to around 250 milliseconds. Okay? So you say, yeah, it's better than 3G. It's better than 2G. But if you compare 4G to a wired connection, to the connection that you have at your office, at home, so it's really high. The latency it's still high on 4G. So that's why, even for those lucky guys on 4G, and for those lucky guys that the 4G is working, right, we still have latency. And the latency is the biggest problem that we do have when we are browsing the web from a mobile phone, because the latency is always there, right? It doesn't matter if you are downloading a small file or a very big file, right? The latency is there because it happens at the TCP level, at the network level. And just to give you an idea here of what happens, right, when users are on 4G. So talking about from Akamai, we do have these stats that on Wi-Fi, 93% of the users are using the main browsers, Safari, Chrome, and Android. But when we move into cellular connections, so it goes down because other browsers that basically are compressing your websites are coming into a stage. So when people are browsing the web through 3G, through cellular connections worldwide, they change browsers because they know that they might be faster using other browsers such as Opera Mini, for example, that is a proxy-based browser. And so this is just to give you an idea of why performance is important on mobile, because we need to care about this to get more users. I know that most of you are thinking on responsive web design. So I'm seeing articles all over the web talking about the mobile web is dead because now everything should be responsive. And responsive means basically that the users are basically resizing the browser. You think that the browser is resizing the browser. And unfortunately, that's not what's happening, right? So most of at least let's talk about mobile devices. On mobile devices, if it's an iPhone, it will be always an iPhone. Yeah, you can go landscape on portrait, but that's all. And the problem is that responsive web design is a tool. It's an excellent tool, and probably it's a tool that it's becoming a default. So we will always use responsive ideas on every website. So that's fine. But responsive web design is not a goal. And a lot of people are achieving responsive web design. Hey, look at my new responsive website. So the important part is the responsiveness, right? And when you set responsive web design as a goal, you're basically missing the point of, and missing the real goal. The real goal is the best possible experience. And your users will not care if your site is responsive, right? They don't resize the browser to see if the UI is changing or updating, right? So users do care if your site is fast. Okay, if you can achieve fast with responsive web design, perfect, right? But your goal is not responsive web design, it's to be fast. Then you decide which techniques you're going to use to create your website. And again, I'm inside your head at this point. And I know that some of you are thinking, hey, come on, Google has said that it will penalize non-responsive websites. Well, that's not what really is happening right now, to be honest. In fact, if you look at Google's websites, google.com, Gmail, Google Inbox, Google Maps, Google Drive, they're not responsive. Come on, they're not responsive. Why? Because we don't need to design every website as responsive. Again, defining responsive web design as a website that has one HTML and probably different CSS and maybe different JavaScript for different devices. So that's the idea, right? So even if you look at the Google recommendations right now, they have different recommendations for mobile websites. So you can create, of course, responsive web design techniques. You can also use dynamic serving, also known as adaptive design. So there are different names here around this. Or you can have a separate URL, like the old idea of a mobile website. So I agree that probably having a mobile website, a separate mobile website, an m.dot website, probably is not a good idea today. We have social networks. We really like to share URLs. I don't want to share a mobile URL that is going to be browsed on a desktop, for example. So that's fine. But we can still do dynamic serving or a smarter responsive web design on some situations. So let me explain this. I'm not saying that responsive web design is bad. I'm not saying that you cannot achieve performance with responsive web design. I'm saying that by default, if you don't think about performance, and you just create a responsive web design solution, you will have problems on mobile. So that's happening on mobile. There are of course a lot of explanations on why this is really happening, right? But it's true. So you need to understand how to measure your website on mobile devices to then realize that probably you are harming performance because you are just using responsive. So there are solutions, by the way. I'm not saying that it's something that you cannot solve. So we can solve the problem. But first, we need to understand that the problem is there. So when talking about performance on mobile, perception is important. We need to remember that rail ideas. And the most important measurements, there are 100 milliseconds for feedback and 1 second for the whole load operation, right? And we can achieve that using the right techniques on mobile. If we achieve these techniques, then we will achieve a better conversion. So more people coming to our websites, more people buying, more people reading articles. We need to understand that on mobile, we have the round-trip time latency that is there, and responsive web design as a goal can be a problem, might be a problem for performance on mobile devices. Just look at newspapers, right? Big newspapers like it can be CNN, New York Times. Most of their websites, they're not responsive, so they're not sharing the same HTML between the mobile and the desktop. So why is that? Because they're losing money if they do that, because of performance. And we need to always test on low hardware and 2G and 3G. So that's my last advice here in the performance section. Now, finally, let's talk about new API and practices that we do have on the mobile web today. And we need to think about this to create like successful web apps. So we are going to here talk about HTTP2, about something called AMP, the offline web, and hardware access. First, HTTP2. I'm not sure how many of you have heard about HTTP2 or have played with it, but we do have right now a final version of the new spec on HTTP. So HTTP2 is basically focused on performance, and it's basically adding a new features on top of HTTP, such as compressed headers and also push. Don't think about the push message from the server like on Android or iOS. It's not about that. So the push means that when the browser is requesting the HTML, the server can answer the HTML, and also it can also push some JavaScript, CSS, and images, because the server can say, "Hey, okay, you're asking me for the HTML, but I know that you will need that CSS, so I will push that CSS for you," and that will increase performance a lot, right? Because of the latency. In this case, we are taking advantage of the same channel that the browser has opened from the original HTML to also send other content that server-side we know that the browser will need. So that's something that you need to understand, right? We do have HTTP2 now. It's working on iOS since version 9, so it's on iOS 9. It's also working on Chrome. So roughly, we have 60 to 70% of users on the mobile web right now supporting HTTP2. Now it's time for you to support HTTP2 on your server and on your websites. Then let me talk a couple of minutes about something called AMP, or Accelerated Mobile Pages. Because performance is a problem on the mobile web. And so even if you don't believe me, then that's fine. You don't need to believe me. But just look at Google. And it's not just Google. It's Google, Twitter, and other big companies, including publishers like New York Times, Financial Times, and other newspapers around the world. They have come to the conclusion that performance is a problem, and we are all losing money because of this. So that's why Google and these partners, they have created a project called AMP, Accelerated Mobile Pages, that it's still a controversial solution, to be honest. It's a subset of HTML using web components, and the idea is that if you have a website for content, now you can provide an alternative solution. So you have the mobile website and the AMP, or you can replace your whole mobile website with an AMP. An AMP website, it's just an HTML. It has some differences. For example, you will see that the HTML element has a lighting icon there. And you have some, for example, you have some specific new elements that you can use. So you cannot use the IMG for images. You have a new one. Instead of video, you're going to use a new one. And it's optimized for performance. And Google has said that it will also cache that when you are creating AMP pages, Google will cache that file server side in Google's servers for free. And when people is going to browse the web in the few months, so it's coming in 2 or 3 months, this to google.com, then people will click on a link, and the link will be there really quickly, because Google is going to pre-cache the AMP page. So if you are going to deliver an AMP version of your website, Google is going to give you a price, and the price will be that it will pre-cache the content for you, so when the user clicks on that link, it will be there. So this is similar to Facebook instant articles. If you have seen this on Facebook, if you have an iPhone and you have a Facebook application, now when you click on some links from main publishers, I know CNET or CNN or Financial Times, they load instantaneously because they're using a similar solution. Why? Because the mobile web is slow. Another new concept that we have right now on the mobile web is progressive web apps. So the name is coming from the Google team, from the Chrome team. I'm not really sure yet how we, as the community, are reacting to the name, but well, anyway, let's talk about progressive web apps. So a progressive web app is basically a responsive layout. That means that, of course, the website will be responsive to different, for example, mobile screens. I'm not saying that it must support a smart TV and also a smart watch, right? So it can be responsive in a small group, for example, responsive between mobile phones only. It works offline. Here comes the important part. Now we can create offline experiences. So we do have the offline web. And to make an offline web, we have several new APIs available. We have some older APIs, such as application cache, and other APIs that will let us work offline. But the most important API that we have right now for this is Service Worker. That is coming from the Google team, that today is available only on Chrome, and Firefox is coming. Microsoft Edge is evaluating the addition of Service Worker. The same happens for Safari. So today it's happening only on Chrome. It's working on Chrome. A Service Worker would let you basically create a background service running on a phone. For example, it works also on desktop. And then we can cache the files locally and serve those cache from the browser itself. So it's like a proxy. So think about the proxy that you install on your computer. In this case, it's in the browser. It's a JavaScript file that it will basically be between the server and your website. And when your website is requesting a file, your service worker can catch that request and, for example, take a response from a cache. Okay, so that will make your app to work totally offline. And you can add that app to the home screen. And when you add it to the home screen, then you have an icon on your phone. When you click on an icon, you have a full screen experience that is totally offline. And of course, it can synchronize data with the server at any time. But the idea is that the web now is available offline. And as I mentioned before, a progressive web app can be installed optionally on the home screen of the device. And from that, after that, then from a user's perspective, your website is just an app. It's just any app, right? It's a native app. Of course, from a a user's perspective. Finally, we also have push notifications now coming on the mobile web. So that's something that usually was available on native apps. So a push notification is a message that you can send to the user even if the user has closed the browser. So now the user can access your website with the right permission. The user will be able to receive push notifications from you even without installing any app. So this is really cool, and right now it's working on Chrome on Android. It probably will come on Safari too, and it's part of what we know as the offline web. And then we have hardware access. Okay, so the last part that I want to mention here of the status of the mobile web today is that now the mobile web has more power than before. So first, we do have access to sensors. So you probably know that we have geolocation access. So we do have access to the GPS or the Wi-Fi location systems. But we also have access to the magnetometer, the gyroscope, the accelerometer, the light sensor, the battery. We can also vibrate the phone with JavaScript. And on latest version of the browsers, we have access to Bluetooth. So, and you say, okay, Bluetooth from a website, so why do I need that thing? Well, for example, I can talk with my lights at home. So I can turn on my lights at home. I have a lights at home that they are Bluetooth based. I can talk to a speaker. Or I can talk to a smartwatch or anything that is Bluetooth to my car. Also, there is something coming called the physical web. And the physical web is an idea that will let us interact with our real physical world. So, for example, I can have, I don't know, it can be a Coke machine or something like that, and I can go with my phone without any app installed. I can open the browser, and the browser will recognize that around my device there is a website, right? The physical web, the web app or the website to talk to that Coke machine. And then instead of typing a URL, instead of taking a photo from a QR code, instead of doing that, using Bluetooth and low energy and beacons, the beacon system, my browser will get the URL and it will load the URL for me, right? With my permission, of course, so it should be an active, proactive action from the user. And that's the physical web. And they're also seeing a lot of new integration with the operating system from the web. So basically, the web is getting bigger. So we have covered a lot of things here, right, in this webinar. So I'm wrapping up right now. So we have been talking about the mobile web itself. So in terms of platforms, browsers, the web view, and what the mobile web means. We have been talking about performance. That is another key issue to have a successful mobile website. Then we have been covering the new stuff that we have around the web, and that's basically offline access, how to get offline. And by the way, offline also means how to work with connections that are not working so well. So because, yeah, maybe we are online, but in the next second we are offline, and then we are online again. So, and we want to provide like a straightforward experience. And finally, we have been talking about this the idea of the physical web. So this is basically the current status of the mobile web. So now I will jump into questions, but before that, so I will be doing some workshops next February, right, in San Francisco. So I hope I can see some of you. So full day workshops on extreme web performance, so the stuff that we have been covering, but with tips. We have a full day for that. The offline web, so that's push notifications, the application cache API, the background sync API, and service worker. And breaking limits on JavaScript. So there we're going to talk about sensors, how to deal with Bluetooth, the physical web, and that sort of things. And there you have my email and my Twitter account also if you have any questions. So I will now stop the sharing. So I hope the connection was good so far. So let me jump into questions. The question is, are those statistics worldwide or any particular region? So the statistic I mentioned before. So that those stats were basically worldwide, and that's a very good question because on the mobile space, right? On the mobile space, usually stats change a lot for region, even sometimes for countries. So, for example, if you go to Asia, you will see a very different perspective than on Eastern Europe, Western Europe, or US. And of course, Mexico is very different to US, and Mexico and Brazil, and Argentina, and Colombia. So every area is different because it has to do with carriers and the phones that are basically available in each country. And so the stats were basically worldwide, but some of those providers that I mentioned on that link, let me go back again to that slide so I can share that again to you. So some of those providers they let you get the stats per country or per region. So for example, you can see that on Device Atlas, or you can see that on Stat Counter. Get data per region. Also, the mobile web report by Wordful, it's that one. You can Google these links, or you can get all these links from here. You can basically like filter your results by country or by region. So that's pretty cool.
Well, looks like you may have answered everyone's questions preemptively, Max.
Perfect. So I hope I didn't send you bad news, right, on responsive web design. There's usually a lot of people complains about that. Hey, but responsive web design should be the way to go. Well, yes and no, so just be careful.
Yeah. So it looks like you do have a question. Do you have stats about mobile web usage versus in-app?
Well, the only resource where you can find that particular information is from the mobile web report from Wordful. So they're making basically quarterly reports on the mobile web, and the last two reports they have stats on browsing on the web view, and that's important because that's new. So usually most developers and designers, they don't realize that their websites are not being rendered inside their browser. There are a lot of things to be concerned about that. So UI performance, compatibility. For example, on Android, the web view is not the same as Chrome. So the user can have the latest version of Chrome installed, Chrome 50. But for example, if they are on KitKat, the web view is based on Chrome 33. And if they are on Android 4.3, it's WebKit. Okay, so even if the user browses the web through Chrome 50, when they're browsing the web inside Facebook, they're using a different engine on that same phone. And you need to understand that because the HTML5 compatibility is not the same, or the CSS compatibility is not the same. So it's something that should warn most web designers and developers. Fortunately, both Chrome and Safari are trying to solve that problem. They're offering now new abilities, right, for native apps. So Facebook in the future, instead of creating an in-app browsing experience, they can use these tools from the OS. It's Chrome custom tabs on Chrome, on Google, on Android, and it's Safari View Controller on iOS. So they can provide a custom experience, a custom browsing experience, but using the browser instead of using a custom browser.
So Corey asks, with the mobile web becoming more of the native experience using hardware and push notifications, where does a native app still beat the mobile web, or does it at all?
Okay, yeah, that's a very interesting question. So it's basically the very old question of native versus web. But yeah, so the web is getting more powerful, and they're getting like native power. And I think that with time, we will see that from a user perspective, at one point, the user will lose perspective in terms of, is this a website? Is this an app? They will not care really, right? Because there are a lot of situations. So just think about this. So I have been last year in 24 different airports, right? 24 different airports. And some airports are offering an app, a native app. And usually I think about this. Do I need 24 apps installed in my phone just to access information about flights? I don't think so, because it's like a temporary access. So sometimes we do want an app installed in our system because we use the app a lot. I know it can be home banking, Facebook, but sometimes I want just temporary access. And I want the full power of a native app because probably I want push notifications. So if my flight is delayed or if they're changing gates, I want to receive a push notification. So I want the power of a native app, but I don't want a native app. I don't want an app. So I want something in the middle. And I think that the mobile web and the physical web and this new approach will help in that situation. And from a user's point of view, it will be just the same, right? So I don't know if it's an app, if it's Objective-C or Swift or Java or HTML, and I don't care, right, as a user. I just want to access a service, and I think that's what we're going to see in the next few years.